This podcast is produced by the team behind the Answered the Call, Australian History, How to Research, World War I, Australian Imperial Force Soldiers, 1914 to 1918 online course. If you're not sure where to start or find navigating websites confusing, this easy to use and practical online course will show you how to confidently research military sources, records, and more. Check out the course webinar at the hyperlink answeredthecall.mykajabi.com for the details of how you can reveal your family's fascinating military history. G'day podcasters, just a special announcement to the competition that we ran for Adam Holloway's Duty Nobly Done book. The winner is Greg Foster. Congratulations to Greg. We'll be in touch with you and get that book out to you shortly. Thank you so much for the continued support of the show. And if you're liking what we're bringing you, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Instagram, and also you can follow us on our Facebook page, True Blue History, and leave a review. And if you can, please subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. So, on to today's episode with Dr. Karl James on the Battle of Tobruk in 1941. So, hope everyone stays well and enjoy this episode. G'day, welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Dr. Karl James from the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, and he's joined us today to talk about the Siege of Tobruk from April to November in 1941. Hi Karl, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Adam. It's a real privilege. Thank you.
So Karl, can you just give us, our listeners, a little background into why you got into military history and why you chose World War II as your main topic?
Yeah, it's a really curious question, and it really it's something I've never really thought of because it's always been part of me. For me, my interest in military history and Australian military history always goes back to my grandparents. The Second World War was their war. They served, in every story of my grandparents, always went back to the war at some point. So my mother's mother served in the British Army. She was there. She remembers the aircraft, the sky being full of aircraft on D-Day, going from Britain over to France. She was at front of Buckingham Palace in VE Day at the end of the war. My grandfather's brother served with number 10 and 460 Squadron, so he served in the Air Force in Europe during the Second World War. And my grandfather himself served briefly in the militia and then was discharged and worked at Lysarts and Wollongong making gauges for Owen guns, like the Owen gun submachine gun. And so growing up, I was just fascinated with their stories about the war, how it affected their lives. My grandparents, both homes, were always full of books. And so I was always looking, the big books about the Second World War, the Spitfires, the German Panzers. It just captured my imagination from a very young age. I had their support and their encouragement. Then studied history at university. And luckily enough, I was able to get a position at the Australian War Memorial, where I've been able to focus on Australia's experience in the Second World War. Now, I've looked at other things. So I've worked on publications and exhibitions relating to the war in Vietnam, Korea. I've dabbled a little bit in Afghanistan. But for me, I keep coming back to the Second World War because it's the biggest and bloodiest conflict in human history. It was the defining experience of the 20th century. And in many ways, Australia's contribution to the war was so vast and so complex that it's still not understood really today. And every time you look into these topics, meet some stories, or go into the archives, read some new stories, there are always more things to find and to discover. And it's that intellectual curiosity that drives me because I think it's just part of me, and I can't ever see me not being a Second World War historian.
So obviously you finished uni, and how did you get to the Australian War Memorial?
Yeah, it's partly I'll always say luck has been a big part of my career, timing, but also focus as well. So in addition to having that love and passion of history, this sounds a bit silly, but in year 12, we went to careers fair. And there was, so, all the different degrees, things people are interested at, different tables from universities. And there was this girl from the University of Wollongong, and she was pretty hot. And I was like, oh, well, having a chat. That prompted me to think about doing history and politics. So I did history and politics as my undergraduate degree at Wollongong, went on to do honours, and then I rolled into the PhD. Which then the PhD question was looking at Australia's involvement during the Bougainville campaign from 1944 to 45. So while I had that strong interest in history, I wanted to pursue it and formalise it through formal study. And then towards the end of my time of the PhD, I also started a Master's in Museum Studies at the University of Sydney, because I thought, well, I love history, I want to work in the field, but I know, and this isn't back in the day, that getting a job in academia was pretty hard. It's almost impossible now. So I thought, well, let's think more widely and become what about a public historian, such as a museum or a gallery? So that's why I did museum studies on top of, or in addition to, my PhD. And then things came together where I submitted my PhD. A position came up at the War Memorial on a 6-month contract 14 years ago. But once I got my foot in the door at the memorial, they have not been able to get rid of me, and I've been able to you work as a public historian. So it's quite interesting, because being an academic historian, there's some similarities, but there's also some big differences. Probably in a university environment, you think about, there's the lecturing, there's the teaching, and you write for the academy. So you need to submit peer-reviewed journals, and that type of thing. Whereas in working as a public historian, you still need that discipline. You still need to be able to think critically, evaluate your sources, but and also being at the memorial, you're very mindful, and I'm always very mindful, that what people see and what they hear isn't necessarily me, Karl James. It's a spokesperson for the War Memorial. So I have to, and we always have to have that level of sensitivity, and just a mindfulness that we are, I'm interpreting your grandfather's war, or my grandparents' war, or someone's parents, or the children of veterans. So it's probably more of a negotiated meeting, but it is incredibly rewarding, because you just get to engage with a range of different people, hear so many different stories about, not just about the Second World War, but the First World War, Vietnam, all the way through to Afghanistan. And in many ways, it's an incredible privilege to be able to do what I do, and I never want to take that for granted. So, and that's why I say, with conversations early with yourself, as well as chatting with Matt McLaughlin, I'd always encourage people to get out there, have his history, and to take part in the conversation.
It's a very special thing that you do. So what's for you, Karl? What's a typical day at the memorial entail?
Well, I never get to do as much researching and writing as I would like to do. So theoretically, I'm writing a book about the Siege of Tobruk, re-evaluating it. We also do a range of other different publications, but a lot of what we do in my section, so the military history section in our team, we do answer public inquiries. So people have a question about the grandparents' experience in the war, for example. In my section too, well, we do that from a member of the public all the way through to the Prime Minister's office and the Governor General's office. So, for example, we reviewed and worked on the speech that the Prime Minister delivered on Anzac Day. So we got the full spectrum. So that's part of what we do. We do a lot of research for the War Memorial itself. We providing historical and editorial advice. We've been exhibition curators. So we've put together exhibitions that have been on display. And then in our spare time, we do researching, writing. We have our magazine Wartime, for example, so we disseminate that. And in many ways, we live in the dream. We get paid to research and write about Australia's involvement in the Second World War.
Absolutely. It's a job that I'm very jealous of, Karl. But I mean, obviously, you've worked very, very hard and studied very hard to get to where you are. And mate, all credit to you. I think, and I think it's a great job that you and Aaron Pegram and all the team at the memorial do. And you should be very proud of what you guys do bring to the general public. And I really think that you convey the message of what the original founder, Charles Bean, what his message was all those years ago when he founded the War Memorial. So, mate, fantastic. Great job.
Thanks, Adam. You have to come visit when you're able to travel. We'll show you around. But I know all of us, because there's about 8 historians in my section, in addition to, say, the official history team. So they're the people who are working on the official histories of Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So the memorial is a very big employer of historians. So we're all very lucky. And there's quite a few history graduates who also work as curators as well. So again, listening to your listeners, if you are interested in history, you can get a job as a historian. They're hard to get. You need to focus yourself, have discipline, apply your studies, but they do exist. So don't just give up on your dreams.
That's a really good point, Carl, and it actually leads us into today's topic. So, when the war broke out, was there a rush for men to enlist like there was during the First World War?
No. The short answer. So we have this notion, say, in August of 1914, you have the very famous pledge of, Australia supporting Britain to the last man, to the last shilling. You have the photographs and the stories of men rushing to enlist, people flocking to the colours. Now, fast forward 25 years later, that doesn't happen. So in September of 1939, war clouds have been gathering in Europe for several years. From about 1938, it seemed as though another European war was inevitable. And so when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France issued their ultimatum. Then 3 days later, ultimatum expires. Germany's still in Poland. Britain declares war, and then therefore Australia is also at war. Now this came, it was the 3rd of September was a Sunday. It was actually Father's Day. And the news broke here at about 9:15 in the evening. What we do see are people who are, there's an element of sadness, a little bit resonant to what had happened. There's not a massive amount of enthusiasm or naivety. There is a stoicism though. It's like, well, this has happened again. We're going to do what we need to do, but there's not that great naivety. There's not the fanfare, the passion of 1914. And that's really because the memories of the First World War are still very fresh. The 14 to 18, 62,000 Australians have been killed. The country emerged following the First World War divided along sectarian lines because of the conscription debates in 1916, 1917. You have this notion that the country is in mourning in some ways, as well as the horrific death toll. There's also the cost, financial cost. There was no real rush to return to that because people very much had those very dark memories. Now, that said, there was a steady increase in numbers and people volunteering for the 2nd Australian Imperial Force during those later months of 1939. The Air Force starts to expand, the Navy starts to expand, but it's not really until May, June of 1940 that you do see a large push of people volunteering for the AIF. And this is at the time of the fall of when France falls. So if you think back to the outbreak of the Second World War, it's often described as the phony war for those first couple of months. Doesn't seem like it's very real. But once Germany invades the Low Countries, moves into France, France falls, you've got the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force. This is when, this is really serious now. So that's where you have a spike in enlistments and volunteering for the AIF. So now I've mentioned that too. So why is that important? Because keep in mind, much like in 1914, in 1939, Australia had a very small military. So we had a tiny, I won't say tiny, we had a modest navy, we had a very small air force, and a tiny army. And basically the army was built around the militia. So they were your part-time citizen soldiers, but we didn't have a large standing regular army. So much like in 1914, when war came around, we had to call up the Australian Imperial Force. 1939, same thing, but we have now the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. And so these were men and women who volunteered to serve for the duration of the conflict, and they knew they would serve anywhere around the world.
So how were the men and women mobilised, Carl? And obviously they had the intentions to send them overseas. So where were they sent to fight?
Well, originally with the AIF, so the first contingents leave Australia, the advance parties leave in early 1939, but most of the big troop convoys depart Australia in early 1940. And they're being sent to the Middle East, so in Palestine and Egypt and Palestine. So again, this is a lot like a rehearsal from the First World War. And why are they doing this? Because you have this large mobilization. And when I say large, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of men enlisting to volunteer. And they've gone from being a civilian, school teacher, a labourer, a farmer, to overnight volunteering for the army. Now that takes time to train someone to become a soldier, to become an infantryman, to become an artilleryman. And so because we don't have the massive training facilities in Australia, they depart Australia to the Middle East, because in 1940, it's kind of be a bit of a backwater, with the view that they would undergo training, and they went into military camps, mainly in Palestine, with the view that once they completed their training, they'd then be sent to fight in Europe against the Germans. But again, like I repeat, the First World War, events were quickly over, circumstances were quickly overtaken by the events. And so from 1940, when the first Australians arrived in the Middle East to conduct their training, in 1940, the Mediterranean, at the start of the year, was a backwater. However, France falls, Italy joins the war on the sides of Germany, and all of a sudden, the Mediterranean, particularly Egypt, goes from being a secondary theatre, or an area of not great importance, to some place that becomes strategically and symbolically important for Britain and the Empire. So our Australian troops go from thinking, we're just going to train in Egypt to go fight in France against the Germans, to being, oh wait, we're training in Egypt and Palestine, and we're going to go fight in Libya against the Italians.
As you say, Carl, it's very similar to the way that the First World War we're training in the sands of Egypt to fight in the green fields of France, and obviously it didn't happen that way. It was they soon got a shock to be fighting in Libya. So can you explain to us? So obviously we're in Libya and we start the Tobruk campaign. So Can you give the audience just a background of how long the Siege of Tobruk went for, and what was the cost to the Australians and the Germans?
Yeah, so Tobruk's a really, I say great story. It's a story of endurance and sacrifice, and it's quite interesting. And it's one of many campaigns that are occurring in 1941. And 1941 itself is a year of victory and defeat for the British Commonwealth forces. So it starts off really quite well. So those first Australian soldiers who were in Egypt and Palestine training during 1940, they start 1941. So a year later, they spearhead the British advance into Libya to fight against the Italians. And that works really well because the Australians capture Bardia, they capture Tobruk, and then they go on to Benghazi. But by around March and then April, those Australians, so the 6th Division, they're sent to Greece, and then later on Crete in April and May 1941 turned out to be disastrous campaigns for the Allies, particularly for the Australians. You have some 5,000 Australians become prisoners of war, or prisoners of Germans, just from those two campaigns alone. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, so while the year had started off quite well, well for the British, but because the Italians were getting smashed, this is when Hitler decides to send Erwin Rommel, and what would become the Afrika Korps, to Libya to boost up the Italians, because he doesn't want the Italians to fall over totally. Rommel arrives in late February 1941, realizes how weak the British forces were in Libya because we were focusing on Greece, and then Rommel goes on the offensive, and so from March through to April, he recaptures all the territory that had been captured a few weeks earlier, or a couple of months earlier. And by April, gets to the outskirts of Tobruk, which by this time is being held by the very inexperienced, or the Green 9th Australian Division, and also has a brigade from the 7th Division, so the 18th Brigade, as well as a very large British garrison, surrounds Tobruk itself in April, and then goes on and fights the British again against the Egyptian border. So all these things are happening in 1941. There's also the campaign in Syria and Lebanon, which takes place in June and July. So from a geopolitical point of view, the Mediterranean is a really hot spot. And for most of 1941, the garrison at Tobruk is the only real place where British and Empire forces, or Dominion forces, and I include the Australians, are actively fighting against the Germans and the Italians, like on the ground. So that's why Tobruk has taken on this very important very symbolic battle, I think, for the Empire, because we're really sticking it to the Germans and the Italians. Because we got smashed in Greece and Crete, No one really talks about Syria against the Vichy French, and our other campaigns in the theatre are not going particularly well. Now, for the siege itself, the Siege of Tobruk lasts from April through to December 1941, from about the 10th of April all the way through to the 7th of December, so some 242 days. And it's probably, well, it is one of the longest sieges in British military history. What makes it important is that while there was a very large Australian garrison, so there was some 30,000 troops defending Tobruk, about half of those, about 14 to 17,000 were Australians, and they were mainly the frontline soldiers. So we have a large Australian presence, and for much of the siege, the garrison is commanded by Major General Leslie Morshead. So you have an Australian commander who's in charge of the garrison for most of the siege. So they hang on for many, many months. And then from September onwards, the Australians start to be replaced by British forces. And the siege continues from September through to December. But even from that very long duration, you still have one Australian unit, the 2nd 13th Battalion, and they're there for the duration of the siege. So it's a real epic of endurance. And from the Australian point of view, so from March through to December of 1941, the 9th Division and its supporting troops suffered 832 men killed, 2,177 wounded, and 941 taken prisoner. So this is a massive campaign from the Australian point of view. Big commitment, big significant role in the battle, but also huge casualties.
So what was the German strengths that were coming at them and attacking Tobruk?
Well, it really varies for the duration of the siege. So the big point is around about Easter of 1941. This is when Rommel makes his first attack against the garrison. And Rommel's attacking with tanks and infantry. The tanks break through the Australian lines, but significantly, the Australian soldiers stay in their outer defensive line, the red line, the outer part of the fortress. The tanks roll through. They're engaged by British artillery. The German tanks are destroyed, and the accompanying German infantrymen are engaged by the Australian soldiers. So there's a big battle in April. Well, it's not big. It's more like an encounter battle. So that's significant. And then there are several other sort of peaks and troughs during the duration of the siege. So in late April, early May, Rommel attacks again, bites off a chunk of the perimeter. And there's some other real key battles in June and August when the Australians, particularly with Morshead, are trying to recapture the ground that's lost. And so this is the ground around the feature that's called the Ras El Madeira feature, Hill 209, but that's better known as the salient. So the Rommel bites off a chunk of it. But really, for much of the siege, it's a combination of Germans and the Italians. So in the key area, the real strategic part that Rommel had bitten off the garrison, the salient area, that was largely held by German forces. But for much of the rest of the outer ring protecting or surrounding Tobruk, they were really Italian forces. But they're really, it's a bit of a mixture because Rommel has to fight on two fronts as well. So he wants to get into Tobruk, wants to take the garrison, wants the Deepwater Harbour, which is really what's significant, but he's also fighting another front against the British along the Egyptian frontier. So he's thinking about fighting in two different places. Now, towards the end of 1941, Rommel was about to make another massive attack to try to break into and capture Tobruk. However, in early December, the British they conduct Operation Crusader, which was a big push to break through and to relieve the garrison. So in many ways, the garrison possibly got a little bit lucky in terms of timing, because had the British not been able to break through with Crusader, it's quite likely that Rommel would have been able to gather his forces together and to punch through and to take Tobruk. The thing to think about is that so Tobruk is often described as the first time German tanks were defeated, or the German assault was defeated in the Second World War on land. Now, that's true to a point, because that first battle, that encounter battle around Easter, which I described earlier, it wasn't a very coordinated attack. Rommel and the tanks and accompanying foot soldiers didn't coordinate their efforts very well. They worked very poorly with the Italians. There was very poor coordination. And really, they were just advancing and to the point where the Italians, for example, didn't give the Germans the map of Tobruk. Now, Tobruk was an Italian fortress. We captured it from the Italians. But that outer defensive line, the red line, which is like 45 kilometres long, and a series of concrete posts, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, these are very strong First World War era school approached fortifications, the Italians didn't tell the Germans where they were. So the German tanks are just rolling through, copping all this fire, totally surprised. So it was a little bit of they were just advancing to contact, really. It was a cheeky attempt at Easter. At the end of April, though, when the Rommel does bite off that chunk of the red line, by that time, that's when the German tanks, artillery, these Stuka dive bombers, so they're real combined bite and hold type tactics they concentrate their fire one post after another and bite into the Australian defensive line, and then they're able to hold it. And because they capture these outer fortifications, that means that when the Australians do go on the counterattack during May, August, and later on in June, it's the Aussies then that are taking the very heavy casualties. They can't recapture the ground that was lost. So you do have this really interesting connection and parallels between a First World War battle in trench warfare being applied to similar tactics and similar weapons to the Second World War, but this time it's in the desert. So rather you've got the 1917 fighting in Passchendaele, against fortifications, concrete pillboxes and the like, using your combined arms, so tanks, artillery, tanks, infantry and aircraft. Similar approach in the desert in Libya, but this time we're doing it in the desert, in the heat, amongst the flies, the dust, insects, that type of stuff. So there's some interesting parallels between the First and the Second World Wars and the land battles that were taking place.
So with the land, obviously you've got the land battles going on, Karl, and then was there the sea battles going on in Tobruk Harbour as well? Or was it more a land battle than a sea battle?
Well, that's a really key point. You've just hit on something that a lot of people miss. So because we, Australians, we do tend to be a bit parochial. We always think, what are we doing? And largely the garrison Tobruk was Australian infantry, but we were with British artillery, with British tanks, Indian cavalry, and a whole range of other nationalities. Tobruk is really a coalition force. But anyway, the second front at Tobruk, there are two fronts at Tobruk. One is the battle for the Red Line, so that's the infantry, the soldiers' war. The second battle for Tobruk is the battle for the harbour. The garrison can only survive because it's regularly supplied by the Royal Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, and a whole host of merchant ships, bringing in food, bringing in ammunition, petrol, oil, reinforcements, and evacuating prisoners, the wounded. So, the soldiers can only hang out there in the Red Line. They can only fight in the salient or around the fig tree or other places because the battle for the harbour. Now, because they're being resupplied by the Navy. Now, once Rommel realises, or he's actually ordered not to try to break in because he's lost too many of his resources, he thinks, right, I'm going to starve the garrison out. So Tobruk becomes subjected to regular airstrikes, both from the German and Italian aircraft, bombing raids. The whole area came under massive artillery attacks. Anywhere in Tobruk could be bombed, strafed, or blown up. And that meant that the Navy's approach into Tobruk Harbour was incredibly dangerous. They called it Bomb Alley. There was something like 750 German and Italian attacks against the harbour because they're trying to sink British and Allied shipping. 33 ships are sunk trying to resupply the garrison, and some 34 ships, including 2 hospital ships, are damaged. So it's a massive naval campaign. It's not a ship-on-ship operation. It's more a ship running against the gauntlet against Stuka dive bombers, against artillery, and the like. So there are the two fronts of Tobruk. One's the battle for the Red Line, and the second one is the sea battle, the battle for the harbour.
Now, I couldn't get over that number, 750. You said, Karl. That is astounding. I didn't know that it was that high.
So So if you think the siege goes for 242 days, and they've subjected to 750 air raids across 200 days. So you've got every day 3 or 4 air raids. It was just phenomenal, and that's why Tobruk was one of the reasons that makes Tobruk different from other battles, because it is this prolonged period of monotony. So the soldiers themselves, they're either in the Red Line, so they're out in the perimeter so they're manning the front line. when they're not shooting at the Germans or the Italians during the day, at night they're going out patrolling into no man's land. They are trying to keep the enemy at arm's bay. You know, and the same as you have in the First World War with those raids and patrols, the tactics to dominate no man's land, to bring back intelligence. Same thing at Tobruk. So in the Red Line, you've got guys going out patrol pretty much every night. Now, when they move back to be a rest, I'm using my air quotes there, they then are working on developing a second defensive line, which is called the Blue Line. And likewise, there was also a third line, the Green Line. So the guys are always working. They're digging trenches. They are bringing up, laying landmines. They're bringing in pickets. They're developing anti-tank ditches. So there's this increased level of fortification throughout the internal perimeter. So they're working all the time. They are constantly being subjected to bombing raids, artillery raids. There's not a lot of variety of food, rations. Their water, for example, the water is always brackish. It would have tasted awful because they come up in jerry cans, so it tastes like petrol. And it's always, always warm. You know, guys write home in their letters saying, I just want to have a cold drink. It's the monotony. And again, if you're thinking about that sense of the endurance of Gallipoli, you know, the lack of food, always being bombed, always being shelled, no rest, no reprieve. Same thing at Tobruk. It just goes a little bit longer. The only way you're going to get it, for many of the guys, I thought the only way they're going to leave Tobruk is if they're killed or if they're wounded. They were there until they're going to be relieved. Moorehead was very clear that there will be no surrender at Tobruk. If they're going to get out, they're going to fight their way out. So you have this very aggressive ethos to hold Tobruk for as long as possible.
It's a great point that you touch on there, Karl. With as soon as you said water being brought up in petrol cans, and my mind went straight to Gallipoli, and it sounds exactly like Gallipoli, just on a bigger scale, like with land and sea battles going on. And wow, that's amazing. But so it leads me into to ask you, the men were given the nickname the Rats of Tobruk. Can you explain why they were given the name the Rats of Tobruk?
Yeah, well, it really follows on from their living conditions. So the guys themselves living in trenches, living in dugouts. There are a lot of natural caves in Tobruk. And so they're living below ground. They're living in caves. And the German propagandist, Lord Haw, as well as a few other German propagandists, used to say over the radio, you're living like rats below ground. You're trapped, you're living like rats. And so, of course, the men themselves, they would listen to these broadcasts, and they took on this name of rats, and they spun it on their head and took on the name the Rats of Tobruk, and really adopted it with defiant pride. And it made them feel, even at the time, it gave them a notoriety and a profile that other soldiers in particularly other Australian units, but also other units across the Dominion forces just didn't really have. So it made them, even during the siege, marking them out as giving them additional recognition, I should say. So they knew they were doing something important, something really significant. Particularly if you got the Lord Haw specifically targeting those Australian defenders at Tobruk. We're like, yeah, totes awesome. We're going to stick it to you guys. And that's partly why you just have that sense of why the Rats of Tobruk have really become immortalised.
Exactly right. It's the old saying, Karl, is you just typical Aussie larrikin, just spin something on its head, just make it our own. Like we were in the First World War, we were, as the famous quote from Sir John Monash, where he says at the Battle of Consequence, "Scream like mad bushrangers." It's the same thing applies here with the Rats of Tobruk. It's just spin it on its head and embrace it. And yeah, they certainly did that.
Oh, totally. We're still talking about them. They were pretty special men.
Oh, absolutely. So would you say, Karl, that the Italians were Rommel's Achilles heel? Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, yes and no. See, the thing is, with Rommel, he only ever really had, in 1941, the equivalent of 2.5 divisions or formations. The bulk of the Afrika Korps really only applied to the German force. There's also the much larger Italian army he's operating alongside them. So the Italians provide the numbers, and technically it was an Italian theatre of operations, and Rommel should have been, following the Italian lead. However, he just did his own thing. And in many ways, he was very critical of the Italians and hugely dismissive. Um, and that's an attitude that you often see both from the soldiers themselves, the Australian soldiers themselves, as well as other British historians. The story about the Italians being pretty nice guys, but not motivated, poorly led. And they were poorly led. They weren't particularly motivated politically. But the thing to keep in mind is an Italian bullet or an Italian shell could kill you as easily and as quickly as a German shell. So you can't just dismiss the Italians or write them off totally for their lack of military efficiency.
No, that's a great point. Absolutely, it's always said that you don't underrate your enemy that you face, and it was something that we from Gallipoli that the British. They thought that they underestimated the Turks, and they paid a very, very heavy price. So exactly right, Carl. I agree with that. An Italian shell or an Italian bullet is just as lethal as a German bullet or a German shell. So absolutely agree on that 100%. So what happened at the end of the campaign?
Yeah, so the siege is lifted on December 7th, 1941, which and I'm sure earlier listeners will recognise the date and why it's important. So 9th Division to come out a little bit earlier, and they go to the Middle East, into Syria and Palestine to rest and refit. Tobruk is lifted, the siege is, Rommel's on the back foot, so for a little while it looks as if, oh, this is great. But in many ways, it's still just the start of the story. So the war continues the following year into 1942. Rommel's resurgent. He sweeps back across from Libya, back across Egypt, and eventually gets to El Alamein. The 9th Division, so that division who'd fought for so long to hold, and in June of 1942, Tobruk falls. So it's being defended by British and South African forces. Rommel makes an attack and very quickly captures it in about 2 days. So, and that was just heart-wrenching and gutting for Moorshead and the men of the 9th Division, because they had held it for so long the year before and then just collapsed when they're not there. But they stick it to Rommel and fight and play key roles at both the battles, the first Alamein in July 42, and then later the main battle in October and November of 1942. And so they stay in the desert for the following year. The 18th Brigade, so who'd also been in Tobruk for a lot of it, they come home to Australia in early 1942. And the 18th Brigade actually go and fight against the Japanese in Milne Bay in August, September. And then at the end of 1942, they're deployed to the Northern Beaches. And so they're fighting around Boona, Gona and Sanananda. And I once met a veteran from the 2nd 10th Battalion, and he fought all the way through from Tobruk, Milne Bay, Boona, New Guinea, and then Balikpapan. And that's in 1945. So this is a really long war. And Tobruk was key, but it's only the start of the story. For many of the men, they would go on and fight against the Germans, the Italians at El Alamein in Egypt, but most of them would then go and fight against the Japanese in Papua, in New Guinea, or Borneo.
As you say, Carl, the war continues. I mean, they have this great siege, and for the men, obviously, when they're relieved, they think, oh, beautiful, we can go for a rest. But then, obviously, the war continues, and they leave the German and Italian front, and they go and now fight the Japanese. So it's these men, mate. They're very, very special. They're a different class. I think today's. I don't think we would do and endure what they went through. And I have the utmost respect for them.
Well, the 18th Brigade is possibly has the most diverse history, because it's formed in late 39, early 1940. It actually goes to Britain. So he's there in the Blitz, goes back to the Middle East, Tobruk, later on in the Pacific. And there's one guy whose work I've been looking at, private memoir. He served in the 2nd 9th Battalion. And he went to Britain, leaves Australia in early 1940, goes to Britain, he's there for the Blitz, Tobruk, back home to Australia. So he's been away for nearly 2 years. When they returned in early 1942, he had 2 weeks leave, and that was it. And then he's off to Milne Bay.
Wow, 2 weeks.
Yeah, he's away for it wasn't even 14 days. Like, it was about 10, I think, from memory. But it just shows that the absence, and even when they are back in Australia, so the 9th Division, for example, so they come back in the Alamein, late 42, they arrive home in Australia in early 1943. But they also very quickly go up to Queensland for some training, and then they're deployed around Lae in September of 1943. So they've been away for 3 years and only have a couple of months in Australia. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get home leave. It means you're coming back, you have a lot of medical tests, and you have to start and retrain everything for jungle warfare and amphibious warfare. So these blokes, and they're predominantly men, it's just an amazing what they went through, their endurance, the stoicism, and they just did it, you know. Yep,
Oh,
sometimes went leave, sometimes went AWOL, guys were discharged, but it's just an incredible stoicism in many ways.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sitting here listening to this story, and I'm just amazed, mate. Like it's, and I see why you study the Second World War, because it's amazing, mate. Like some of these stories are just, they're mind blowing. Like 2 weeks leave, and like it's just unbelievable. It just, and I now get why you enjoy studying World War II, because the stories are just amazing.
And I think that's why, but that's also, yeah, 100%. I'm thinking you probably hear how excited I am now just with the chance to talk to you about it. But it's also, in some ways, it's the challenge of the war, because there is no single narrative. I tend to feel the Australian experience in the First World War is more straightforward. You know, war begins, training in Egypt, Gallipoli, Somme 16, Ypres 17, Somme 18. Oh, and by the way, there's some dudes in the light horse in Sinai, Palestine. We think about our involvement in the Second World War, and already the units I've just been talking to you about. There's guys here, there's guys over there, there's units all over the place. In 1941, there are multiple campaigns being fought. First Libyan campaign, Greece, Crete, Tobruk, Syria, the Navy's involvement in the Mediterranean, and that's just there. You've also got the Australians serving in the RAAF, in Bombing Command. And then what we're now looking at, when we're looking at stories of, it's easier to follow units, so your battalions, your brigades, your squadrons, ships. There's a whole bunch of Australian individuals, so men and women, who are serving with British and Allied, well, mainly British, but with Allied forces. And there's this whole host of diverse experiences. And they're the stories we're really starting to scratch the surface at. One of my favourites is an Australian bloke. He's a teacher goes to New South Wales. He goes to South Africa before the start of the Second World War to continue his teacher education. War breaks out. He joins a Scottish South African unit. He fights at El Alamein in an armoured unit, he's in an armoured unit. He's then seconded to the British Army, joins the Commandos, so he's number 3 Commando unit. He's commissioned, joins the Commandos, and is awarded a military cross for fighting, because they then they serve and support Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia. And then late in the war, 1945, they're in northern Italy fighting. So this is one Aussie bloke. He's just going all over the world. And when just shortly after VE Day, he's in, because there's this photograph of him, and he's sitting in a gondola in Venice. So there's this one Aussie, and he just does everything. And during that 6 years, at one point, he did get a bit of leave. He was able to come back to Australia, married his girlfriend, who was a nurse in the Australian Army. She went on serve in LA. And that's just a phenomenal. That's just one story. We now of Olive Sherrington. So she was an Australian widow. She went on a world cruise before the outbreak of the Second World War. War begins. She joins the British Army. She's there driving trucks and is evacuated with BEF from France. And then in 1944, she goes back with the British Army after D-Day. So there's incredible individual stories as well as the big unit stories. So there's just so much going on. But because there's no single narrative, I think now it makes it very hard for us to follow the Australian story. What was Australia's story in the war? Well, it's everything. And that's just the operational stuff. What goes on the home front in terms of the mobilisation of Australian industry and science and technology is just phenomenal. So it makes it's almost like the war is now too big for it to really grasp. And that's why I think in the retelling of it now, decades later, it's things such as Tobruk. Well, it was Tobruk. It's now been overshadowed by Kokoda, but you've got Changi. And so you've got multiple stories that kind of by necessity has to become one or two key events or key experiences. And so what's now important is that sense of, what the soldiers portrayed. So courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice, those values are the things that prove to be sort of lasting, rather than specific campaign narratives or the boom of Australian defence industries, for example. So it's a massive war, it's so important to Australia.
Oh, absolutely. And like you touched on, I think it could lead into another podcast, get you on, Carl, and talk about the home front. That's during the war. I feel that's a topic that isn't touched on very much. We don't touch on the home front as well. So maybe another podcast down the track, mate, to get you on and have a chat.
Yeah, love to. But once you start, I won't be able to stop.
Mate, that's it. No, it's great, and these stories do need to be told because they've been forgotten for too long. So over the last 5 years, we've seen that the Australian population has really got behind the remembrance of World War One. And we've had a lot of 75th anniversaries of World War II that have largely been unnoticed. Do you feel that we are not remembering the World War II battles and men and women that served?
I think I understand the interest in the centenary of the First World War as a massive event. The conflict was a massive event, and it was a big part of our history and what has become our national identity. So you can appreciate why. However, personally, I always think we can do more for the Second World War veterans, particularly because they are still with us. From a population of nearly 7 million Australians in 1939, so almost 1 million Australians served during that conflict, which was almost 1 in 7. From a phenomenal number, and 500,000 Australians served overseas. Now, how many are with us today? In 2015, it was around about 20,000 Second World War veterans. Now in 2020, how many of them are now with us? So I think this is really our last opportunity to tell these stories, to ask new questions, and to thank them for what they did for us. Keep in mind, these were the men and women who stood to defy Hitler, who stood up to Mussolini, who fought to defend Australia from imperialist Japanese expansion. They are a remarkable generation. We need to say, and we need to acknowledge their service and sacrifice while they are still here with us today. Now, yes, it is truly tricky. It's 80 to 75 years from this conflict, and there will always be other events and other events, other campaigns, other conflicts, other groups of veterans who should also be talked about. And I am pretty biased. I think Australian history should always be told. But I personally do feel we need to do more to mark and commemorate Australia's Second World War. And it's not just I think, somewhat passive ceremonies. We need to think about, we do podcasts, publication, documentaries, film, and ask new questions. And that's the one thing I'm always banging on about. It's like, how do we find new questions? How do we tell the story more? How do we have commemoration through understanding? So it's not just passive, it's a very active way to learn and to respect. And for what we're doing right now, telling these stories, hopefully someone who may not have heard of this story before or has only come across the name of Tobruk but hasn't really twigged to why it's important. I think if someone who's listened to our conversation today hears that and reads a book, asks their family, and actually, granddad or great uncle was in Tobruk, then we've done job done for today. And that's a very proactive sense of commemoration, I think.
No, I agree 100%. And like I've said throughout the podcast, that their stories, these men and women's stories, they need to be told, Carl. The future generations that are coming through, they have to be told that the men and women that went before them, they fought for the freedom that we enjoy today, and that we've had in a sense we've had taken away from us in the coronavirus pandemic. We've had yes, we're not fighting a war, and I don't shy away that we're not fighting a war like they did, but we are fighting an enemy that we can't see. It's an invisible enemy, but we've had our freedom taken away in this pandemic. And I can see why the men and women that went before us, they fought so hard. And now I have an appreciation for what they did and giving us our freedom. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've had a tiny little taste. Keep in mind rationing, for example, and rationing's a great one. So rationing was introduced in Australia in 1940 and went all the way through to about 1948, 1949. And so that was, fuel, food, butter, textiles. Um, Everything was rationed, everything was restricted. So, for example, pink icing sugar was banned for the duration of the war. Women they shared wedding dresses amongst themselves. Men's suits went from being a double-breasted suit down to a single-breasted suit. In 1942, the name Santa Claus was banned Santa Claus and Father Christmas was banned in advertising campaigns to stop people spending their money. So that's real, sticking it to us. When we had a bit of a crisis a couple of months ago, everyone panicked and bought toilet paper. Our grandparents had it way tougher than we ever did.
Oh, absolutely. You're right, Carl. It's we did get a bit silly there a couple of months ago, but so as the World War II veterans numbers continue to get smaller, do you think that World War II has the same significance as World War One?
It's an interesting question, and it comes down to your perspective. So, for example, understanding the Second World War is still key to looking at, say, the way in Southeast Asia. So, how does China, Korea, and Japan interact? So, the legacies of the war is still felt in those countries. Likewise, in Russia and Eastern Europe, Russia is almost refighting the Second World War at the moment. So, because it influences the way the former countries of the USSR. So, it's very key in those countries. In Britain, you've seen a massive resurgence in nostalgia for the Second World War, the spirit of the Blitz, and a lot of it, rightly or wrongly, and I would suggest probably wrongly, was used for the Brexit debate. So it's more passionate, I think, and recognisable in other parts of the world than what it is here. For here, we are still, and forever will probably always be in the shadow of Gallipoli. And so while I think the Second World War was the conflict that shaped Australia during the 20th century and was probably one of the most one of the most significant and important conflicts that Australians have ever participated in, I don't think it will ever get away from Gallipoli forever. And so in many ways, Tobruk, Kokoda and Changi, they will always be in Gallipoli's shadow.
I agree, and like Carl, you've been to Gallipoli, haven't you? You've actually been to Gallipoli, yeah. So I've been to Gallipoli as well, and we should remember Gallipoli, but we should also remember the sacrifice of the men and women of the Second World War. I think it's important to keep telling their stories as well as continuing to tell the First World War stories. And I agree. I think we do the men and women a disjustice if we don't tell their stories.
Absolutely. And when we're able to travel again in the future, I'd also encourage everyone to get out there and explore Australia's Second World War battlefields. Prior to Corona, Gallipoli and the Western Front is far more accessible than where Australians have fought during the Second World War. But having been to places such as Lueliang, which is in Java, so I went there with a group from the Second Pioneer Battalion Association a few years ago, and that was a massive privilege. But looking at the battlefields in Java, to Port Moresby, to Bomana War Cemetery, to Milne Bay, to look at the Owen Stanleys, and as well as Singapore, there's some really cool battle sites in Singapore. That itself also helps out sense of understanding, commemoration, and exploring to go to these sites and say, let's read up about it, but let's go. And Bomana War Cemetery is probably as powerful as some of those cemeteries in the Western Front, Tyncott, for example, and the others. So again, the First World War doesn't have a monopoly. That said, will contradict myself. Gallipoli is pretty amazing and pretty spectacular. I remember the first Aaron Pegger and I, we went on a joint Australian War Memorial Imperial War Museum study tour. And I remember getting off the bus at Anzac Cove, and the hairs in the back of my neck stood up. I was like, wow, this is it. This is where it all starts. It's where it starts, but certainly doesn't end by a long way. So get out there, read a book, and where we can travel, let's go off explore these Second World War battle sites.
Oh, absolutely, mate. It definitely, and like I said to you, now I'm interested definitely in when we can travel, getting over and seeing some of the Second World War sites where we fought. And it's just before we wrap it up, Carl. So, what are you working on at the moment? Where and how can people or our listeners get in touch with you?
So I'm working on a few different projects. I've contributed with my friend, colleague, Lachlan Grant. We've just done a single chapter on Australia's involvement in the Second World War for a Routledge history of the Second World War. So that's a big international publication. With Peter Dean and I. So Pete Dean and I, we're co-editing a volume looking at Australia in the Second World War from a campaign as well as a home front point of view. We have a dozen different contributors. And then my big long-term sort of pet project is a new book on the Siege of Tobruk, reassessing the siege, thinking about how did Morshead hold it? Why is it important? How did they hold it? And what are some of the other issues? So again, Tobruk is an example of coalition warfare. So the Australians are there, there's Brits, there's also Indian soldiers, there's Poles, there's Czechs. And now looking at it in a little bit more closer detail, I also know there were Palestinians who were working there. You've got the Italian civilians who were evacuated from Tobruk. There are Arabs who also have to be evacuated during the siege. From German point of view, Italian sources, most of the people we're fighting against during the Siege of Tobruk are probably Italian soldiers rather than Germans. But we all think the Germans, but the Italians did much of the day-to-day type of fighting. So, how did the air supply work? How did the Navy work? Psychological injuries, psychological injuries. So being bomb happy, for example, how did they deal with that during the Siege of Tobruk? There's lots of new questions. And so Tobruk is my ongoing topic. Join in on Twitter. I mean, I find Twitter is probably the best way for everyone to engage and to have these conversations and to meet up with people who are working in similar fields. And I just join the conversation on Twitter.
Yeah, no, I look forward to reading that book when it comes into publication, mate. I look forward to getting my hands on that, and it's been terrific to get you on, and like we've almost spoken for an hour, and I mean we could have spoken for 3 or 4 hours, but Dr. Karl James, it's been fantastic, and I do appreciate you giving up your time to talk to us, and mate, we'll definitely get you back on the show in the near future. So, Dr. Karl James, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.